I'm going to call the meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization Administration and Finance Committee to order. Ibu Kureishi will read the next three slides, please.
Ibu, would you like me to do that? I think we were unable to hear you.
Haral, why don't you go ahead and do it?
Okay, great. Notice of non-discrimination. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. Oops. Sorry, I have a lag with my mouse, but the next one is the accessibility statement. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, or if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Ibu Qureshi, MPO staff at iquraishi@ctps.org or 857-702-3695 or via the chat box. These are the virtual meeting guidelines. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. Please raise your hand via Zoom if you would like to use an AI note taker during this meeting. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Chair, for introductions.
Thanks, Haral. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I'm Brian Kane. I have the great honor to chair this committee with the indulgence of my fellow committee members. I am the head of the MBTA Advisory Board. I am delighted to be here. It looks like we have everyone on the committee is present. So Ibu, if you can't, Haral, do you mind calling the roll, please?
Sure, I could do that. Brian Kane.
Present.
Dennis Giambetti. Eric Barassa.
Good morning, Eric Barassa.
Jen Rowe.
We saw her earlier. She is here.
I think she mentioned she would be right back.
There you go.
Sam Taylor.
Taylor present.
Caitlin Allen Conley.
Caitlin Allen Conley present.
Len Diggins.
Diggins here.
And John Strauss.
John Strauss present.
Great.
Thank you.
Wanted to make sure Dennis is sometimes on his phone, so Dennis Giambetti.
Great. Okay, well, Dennis is we'll let us know if he's here when he gets the chance. So we also have lots of staff and other attendees. Thank you all for being here. I just want to note at the start of the meeting that the fiduciary agent agreement update has been added to the agenda before the goals update from the CTPS executive director. We have a hard stop at 10, and a lot of us have other things to go to, so we will monitor the time. We might postpone Tegan's goal update if necessary. So we'll now move on to agenda item number 2, which is public comment. Are there any members of the public who would like to provide comments to the committee at this time? You can use the raise hand function, and we'd be delighted to hear from you. Seeing none, we'll move on to agenda item number 3. This is an action item. Approval of the minutes of the February 12th, 2026 meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve the meeting minutes of February 12th, 2026? Eric Barassa.
Eric Barras, I'll make a motion to approve the meeting minutes of February 12th.
Thank you, Eric. Is there a second?
Second, Caitlin Allen Conley.
Thank you, Caitlin. Haral, why don't you call the roll, please?
Sure. Brian Kane.
Yes.
Sorry.
Brian Kane, yes.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barras, yes.
Jen Rowe. Sam Taylor.
Sam Taylor, yes.
Caitlin Allen Conley.
Caitlin Allen Conley here.
Len Diggins.
Diggins, yes.
John Strauss.
John Strauss, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. That item is approved unanimously. We'll move on to agenda item number 4, State Fiscal Year 2026 Operating Budget Update, Quarter 3. Haral Gandhi will present this item. Take it away, please, Haral.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. My name is Haral Gandhi, and I'm the Director of Finance and Operations at the Boston Region MPO. Apologies, there's a little bit of a lag. Okay. Today's financial presentation is divided into 2 sections. The first section provides an update on the Boston Region MPO's financial performance through the 3rd quarter of SFY 26, including year-end revenue, expense, and overhead projections. The second section focuses on the proposed SFY 27 operating budget, including anticipated funding sources, major cost drivers, and planned expenditures. I will begin with an update on the SFY 26 financial performance through March 31st, 2026, which marks the end of the 3rd quarter. The state fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th, so these figures represent 9 months of actual revenue and expense activity. I will review actual revenues and expenditures to date, discuss key budget variances, and highlight updated projections for the remainder of the state fiscal year. This table summarizes quarterly revenue, expenses, surplus or deficit activity, and the overhead rate through quarter 3. Before reviewing the quarter 3 results, I will note that the quarter 2 figures were updated since they were last presented, and that was because the accounting period had not fully been closed when we presented it. Revenue increased slightly due to additional interest income, while expenses increased primarily due to the processing of an approximately $25,000 medical insurance bill. Through the 3rd quarter, total revenue is approximately $6.09 million, and the total expenses are approximately $6.07 million, resulting in a modest positive balance of about $29,000. The overhead rate through quarter 3 is currently 119.40%, compared to the approved provisional rate of 122.59%. While below projections, quarterly fluctuations are expected due to the timing of expenses, staffing allocations, and consultant activity. This slide compares projected revenue through quarter 3 to actual revenue received by the funding category. Overall, revenue performance remains generally aligned with expectations. MPO and MassDOT directed planning funds are currently at approximately 93% of straight line projections, while MassDOT SPR and other revenue is below projections primarily due to the timing of project activity. MBTA revenue is currently above projections, and the other category, which includes competitive grants such as SS4A, MADI, and MVP grants, is also above projections, due primarily to the extension of the SS4A grants. Overall, the total revenue through quarter 3 is approximately 99% of projections. We continue coordinating closely with project managers to ensure spending and billing remain aligned with program budgets and available funding. This slide compares projected expenses through quarter three to actual expenses by category. I will be describing each category in detail in the second section of the presentation. Overall, spending remains generally aligned with straight line projections. Administrative and direct labor expenses are both slightly below projections, primarily due to staffing vacancies, lower than anticipated overhead spending, and differences between projected and actual staff charging patterns throughout the fiscal year. Direct costs are above projections, largely driven by higher consultant spending and project-related direct expenses during the third quarter. These are pass-through costs and do not impact the overhead rate. Overall, the total expenses through quarter three are approximately 98% of projections. This slide summarizes the current SFY 26 year-end projections compared to the approved budget. Projected year-end revenue is approximately $7.83 million compared to the approved budget of $8.24 million, while projected expenses are approximately $7.84 million. At this time, we're projecting a small year-end surplus. The projected overhead rate is currently estimated at 121.09% compared to the approved rate of 122.59%. We will continue monitoring revenues, staffing allocations, consultant activity, and administrative spending closely as we move toward year end. And then before I move on to the proposed SFY 27 operating budget, I will pause to answer any questions or discuss anything I've presented in more detail.
Questions for Haral? Okay, seeing none, Haral, thank you. We can move on to the next item, please. And apologies for the camera being right in my face. I know this is just what y'all want to see right in the morning. I need a better setup here in my office.
Well, thank you, Brian. Before I get started with the SFY 27 proposed budget, I just wanted to note that we had to post a revised operating budget table this morning, and that is available now on our meeting calendar. And Annette has posted a link to that in the chat. So I'll be referencing the revised operating budget table. And the key difference from the one that was posted before and this one is for the year-end projections for SFY 26. And so I'll go through that in more detail next. Let's see. So I will now walk through the proposed SFY 27 operating budget, focusing on projected revenue and expenses as well as provisional overhead rate. Welcome back, Jen. Okay. Okay. Throughout this section, I'll reference the supporting budget documents posted with the ANF meeting materials, including projected revenue table, the operating budget memo, and the revised operating budget table. And a link is also added into the chat for easier access. This table summarizes the anticipated funding sources supporting the agency in SFY 27, including contract periods, associated budgets, and projected revenue. The total projected revenue for SFY 27 is $9.23 million, representing an increase of about 12% compared to SFY 26. Approximately 72% or $6.6 million of total revenue is expected to come from MPO3C planning funds, with the remainder anticipated from MassDOT, MBTA, and competitive grants. The projected competitive grant funding totals approximately $1.42 million for state fiscal year 27. This includes funding from the Prioritization Process Pilot Program, also known as the P4 grant, and the SS4A grants, which continue to support expanded planning and safety-focused initiatives across the region. Next, I'll review the proposed operating expenses for SFY 27. This table outlines the major expense categories included in the proposed operating budget. The total projected expenses for SFY 27 are approximately $9.23 million and are grouped into three major categories: direct labor, direct costs, and administrative expenses or operating expenses. Based on the current revenue projections and planned work activities, the proposed budget supports 68 full-time professional positions, including 5 grant-funded positions. The budget also includes per diem employees supporting field data collection activities, as well as merit and promotional pool for salary adjustments. Overall, the proposed direct labor budget reflects additional staffing needed to support the competitive grant work and represents approximately a 13% increase compared to the SFY 26 projections. We currently have 56 staff members and are actively recruiting for 2 open positions, with an additional position expected to be posted next week. Next is the direct costs. So lines 2 through 9 represent direct or pass-through costs that are charged directly to grants and contracts. These costs are fully reimbursable, do not impact the overhead rate, and in most cases require prior approval from the contracting agency before being charged to a project. Overall, the proposed SFY direct cost budget is generally level funded compared to the approved state fiscal year 26 budget. The IT equipment line item includes funding to replace critical server room infrastructure and remains under review, pending decisions related to a potential office space relocation. IT-related expenses are represented in both direct cost and administrative expense categories. In general, IT equipment with a value greater than $5,000 is funded through the 3C contract and included within the direct costs, while routine IT operational expenses are reflected within the administrative expenses. The consultant line item is primarily driven by the SS4A and P4 grant activities, which account for 78% of the consultant budget. In addition to the final phase of the federal fiscal year 26 deobligated MPO funds, funded work supporting the Routable Mobility Network and development of the TDM 27 model. We have submitted a request for access to the deobligated federal fiscal year 27 funds in accordance with MassDOT guidance. These funds are not currently reflected in this proposed budget because the request is still under review and pending approval. The remaining direct cost categories support project-specific activities such as translation and interpretation services, public engagement support, software subscriptions, MPO meeting expenses, and other operational needs. Next, I will talk about the operating expenses. Operating expenses represented in lines 10 through line 59 account for approximately $4.6 million, or about 50% of total projected expenses. These overhead or indirect costs are not directly linked to a specific project or contract. Instead, they support the agency's overall operations and generally remain relatively consistent from year to year. These expenses include administrative activities, employee benefits, IT equipment and software, office rent and maintenance, recruitment, professional services, administrative travel and conferences, and other operational expenses. This slide highlights several notable changes reflected in the proposed administrative budget or operating budget for state fiscal year 27. Under staffing and workforce costs, lines 12 and 13 increase due to higher projected staffing levels and associated administrative time and paid time off costs. Line 26 includes funding for staff engagement events that support collaboration, onboarding, and employee engagement activities across the agency. Line 48 includes a modest increase for temporary staffing support if needed. In SFY 26, this line exceeded the budget due to the support needed to maintain administrative operations during vacancies within the finance and operations team. Line 50 reflects higher conference and travel costs, primarily due to the increased flight and hotel rates. Line 57, the fiduciary agent fee, increases with projected payroll growth because it is calculated as a percentage of payroll expenses. Under office and facilities, line 40 includes potential office relocation costs, while line 41 assumes a new office lease and storage. And finally, line 46 includes projected legal and consulting support costs. The final slide summarizes the provisional overhead rate calculation for SFY 27. The overhead rate is calculated by dividing annual administrative expenses by direct labor expenses. Based on the proposed budget, the provisional overhead rate is projected at 122.61%, which is consistent with the state fiscal year 26 approved rate. And with that, I want to thank everyone for your attention and consideration of the proposed state fiscal year 27 budget. I would be happy to answer any questions or discuss any portion of the proposed budget in more detail.
Thank you, Haral. Appreciate it. A lot of work went into this, and I have a couple of questions, but we'll start with Mr. Eric Barassa. Go ahead, please, sir.
Haral, thank you. That was a great overview. I have two questions. First one, for the positions to be hired, is that 12 positions? Is that, you said there's 56 and you're budgeting 68?
We're at 56 right now. We're actively recruiting for 2. They're posted, and then we have 1 more being posted next week. So yes, overall, we're going to try to get to 68 positions throughout the next fiscal year.
And most of those are to fund the to do work from those federal discretionary grants.
5 of them, yes. 5 of them are yes.
Okay. And then my second question is, what is the request for the unobligated funds? Just curious about what that's for.
For the federal fiscal year 27?
Yeah.
Let me check. Actually, Tegan, do you have that?
I can probably answer that a little quicker just because it's very much on my mind. First, I just wanted to say, Eric, about the grant funded positions. Those are really genuinely just assumptions right now. We're still working on what we think would be the best approach. So we had to include something in terms of an assumption, but we're still working on what that exactly looks like. So we'll have more information about that in the coming months. And just to note, while we have the third SS Frey grant under contract, we also still don't have the P4 grant under contract. So that's part of the waiting and kind of continuing to plan as well. As far as the deobligated PL request for federal fiscal year 2027, we actually made a really robust request. Our federal partners have been encouraging us to try to spend down the balance that's accrued over a number of years, just based on, kind of ups and downs over the years and some of the constraints we had with attrition and spending during the pandemic years, especially. So we asked for some funding towards training, towards some additional website consultant support to get our public-facing internet active. We requested some support for an intern, and then also for a number of sort of studies. Those included a data and technology best practices and strategy. That also included some remediation we were planning to do, that we have to do actually, related to some of our interactive apps. We asked for funding to access the funding for a second phase of the Routable Mobility Networks project work that we're doing. We also asked for funding towards a study to advance transit-oriented development on the MPO level. That was also an idea that came up in the UPWP discrete study process. We asked for support for funding an evacuation routes study, which was something that some of our MassDOT partners were interested in us partnering with them on. I believe we've been talking with your staff about that as well, Eric. And then also some additional support to continue towards developing our modeling tools as we have the long-range plan that we're ramping up next year, but also so that we could shift into a more exploratory basis. Now, all that to say, that sounds very amazing that we might be able to fund all that, but on the MassDOT side of things, funding is very constrained. So what we've found so far in the application is that MassDOT's only been able to provide a very small amount of the total matching funds that would be needed to fund all of those. So right now we're working to revise our proposal down to just a few of those to sort of maximize our use of the available matching funds. So it's not just what we request on the federal side, it is how much MassDOT can come forward on the matching side, and this is a very constrained year for them. And then the last thing I'll say is we're also, particularly on one of these, where we're working with another institution, we're looking for alternate matching funds that then we can come back and say we can pursue, particularly it's the routable mobility network work, without having to ask for MassDOT support for matching funds. Long answer, but it's a big request, so sorry for the level of detail.
Thanks.
So I had a question. 1.3 consultants, how does, based on what you just said, Tegan and Haral, how does that line item work with the deobligated funds that have been requested? Because I see a note in here that it mentioned deobligated MPO funding. So what happens if we don't get those funds?
I can start with that. We haven't included the FY20 federal fiscal year 27 funds in this operating budget. If
I see.
and when we do get those, we will amend the budget appropriately, and then we will present it at the next ANF meeting.
Okay, I guess it's a pretty low risk relative to everything else because it's consultants, and I guess that's why you want to do it with consultants and not FTEs. I think I don't know, I don't want to speak for the committee. I think we've seen at the T the value of bringing in FTEs to do this work over time, but I understand if it's soft money, you can't do that. Yes, take it, please.
Just to be clear, that's actually not a decision that we make in our application for those funds. That's actually guidance / requirements from MassDOT on MassDOT's side in terms of they'll approve some of the matching funds, but only if those deobligated funds are going towards consultant time rather than full-time staff time. So that comes from their guidance.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I appreciate that. And I guess I'll also just say overall in the budget, I think as a committee, we've been very supportive over the last few years of the increased staff travel, the professional partnerships that have been engaged in. I think these are really important to the staff and to the professionalization of the work that our amazing staff do. And I'm very happy to see that continue. I do want to just, again, I know I've said this for the last few years, and I know you're working on it. We need a lease for your office space. You need a better office space. So I know I'm a bit of a broken record on this, but I will continue to advocate for this happening. It's just good business practice to have stuff spelled out on paper. And I know you're working on it. I know there's things moving. I appreciate that there are additional costs for moving to new space in this budget, which I am heartened to see because I take it that means things are potentially happening in this next fiscal year, which is great. With that said, please continue to push in that direction. And I think I speak for everyone on the committee when I say we will be as supportive as possible to move that forward. Any additional questions or comments on the fiscal 27 operating budget as presented? Okay, if not, can I get a motion to recommend on behalf of the ANF committee that the Boston Region MPO approve the state fiscal year 2027 operating budget as presented? Mr. Eric Barassa.
I'll make that motion.
What a guy. Jen Rowe.
I'll second that motion.
That's an amazing second. Haral or someone want to call the roll, please?
Sure, I could do that. Brian Kane,
I'm a yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Sam Taylor,
Sam Taylor, yes.
Caitlin Allen Conley,
Caitlin Allen Conley, yes.
Len Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
John Strauss.
John Strauss, yes.
And I just want to double check, did Dennis Giambetti join the call? Okay, thank you for that.
I just saw Dennis come on the camera for a second, but he's here in spirit. God love you, Dennis. All right, we'll move on to, and again, folks, apologies for rushing a little bit, but I wanted to make sure we had ample time for this important discussion. We are delighted that Lizzie Wyant, the Executive Director of MAPC, can join us.
Yes, Dennis Chimetti, yes.
Thank you, Dennis. Hey. And so we're delighted to welcome Lizzie and Tegan for agenda item number 6, fiduciary agent agreement update. Take it away, please.
Sure, I'll just kick us off incredibly briefly. So thank you for already introducing Lizzie Wyant. We're glad to have her here today representing our fiduciary, MAPC. Just for context for why we're having this conversation, the staff to the MPO, originally known as Central Transportation Planning Staff, or CTPS, we were established back in 1973 as an independent group of experts. But the staff, when established, needed a legal employer. And so MAPC took on the role as fiduciary to the staff and continues in that role to this date. So as a fiduciary, and Lizzie will talk more about this, MAPC provides finance, legal, human resources, and procurement support to the MPO. However, at the same time, the staff, as you know, is led by its own executive director. So I oversee and guide the work of the staff, and I do that consistent with the vision, goals, and objectives established by the Boston Region MPO board. So that's sort of the distinction. And over the years, both of our staff have changed quite a bit. And so over the last several years, we've been working together on an update to the agreement that defines this fiduciary relationship, which is also called out in our memorandum of understanding for the MPO. So with that, I will pass it over to Lizzie Wyant, as we already said, Executive Director of MAPC, to give us an update on the process that we've been working on together. Lizzie, I'll give it to you.
Thanks, Tegan. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. I'm really glad to be able to be here to talk a little bit about the fiduciary agreement and where we are in that process and a little bit about what it looks like. As Tegan said, I'm the Executive Director of MAPC, the regional planning agency serving the 101 cities and towns of metropolitan Boston. I have been in this role since about September. But I've worked with Tegan and actually the BRMPO staff for many, many years. And so I was glad for the opportunity to be able to continue to work more closely with all of you. So the fiduciary agreement, I wanted to say as like a threshold issue that this conversation is definitely an opening conversation. I know that this body will actually see the formal fiduciary agreement that the organizations agree to, and I think advance it. And so but I wanted to come, and Tegan asked me to come to talk a little bit about where we are in the process, a little bit about the background of the fiduciary and some of the contents before you have a chance to see it. So I think part of the challenge for me when I moved into the role is that there had been some ongoing conversations about the fiduciary agreement. And when I first moved into the position, I was sort of told we're like almost at the finish line of finalizing this agreement between the organizations. But it turned out we were at like the wrong team's finish line, and there was a lot of work to do to kind of go through the agreement and make sure that it actually was the strongest possible agreement for both organizations. So a little bit about what is included in the fiduciary agreement. The agreement itself reflects the relationship that Tegan described between MAPC and the Boston Region MPO. In addition to that, the first part, which is the fiduciary itself, the agreement includes 3 appendices. And the appendices actually detail all of the roles and responsibilities and the actual specific pieces of work that are held at MAPC and at the Boston Region MPO. So the fiduciary agreement is sort of the top legal part of the document. It's actually relatively short and straightforward, but then the appendices detail all of the specifics of the work that happens. And there's 3 particular aspects of the appendices that we really wanted to make sure that we were getting right in this version of the fiduciary agreement. So it outlines the legal roles and responsibilities. MAPC's general counsel, Margie Weinberger, who I believe is on this call, and actually Brian has been very involved in some of these lease conversations with the Boston Region MPO and other space issues recently. So it outlines our legal roles and responsibilities. It outlines HR roles and responsibilities, and it outlines finance roles and responsibilities. And then included in there, across the HR and the finance piece, is roles and responsibilities related to benefits. But at MAPC, those actually span two departments, so you kind of see it in the appendix show up in more than one place. So the fiduciary agreement and the appendix themselves go into kind of a lot of detail about what those roles and responsibilities look like. So, Brian, kind of to your point, that it's clear to everybody and it's on paper and everybody has a clear understanding. It does also include this cost allocation portion. That's where that number that Haral was mentioning about the percentage of staff of payroll is paid from the Boston Region MPO back to MAPC to support again, all of the work that we are doing in support of the Boston Region MPO as a fiduciary. And, Tegan and I have both agreed that it's responsible to look a little more closely at that cost allocations. That is part of what we are doing in this conversation as well. I think I'm going to stop there, Tegan, unless there's specific pieces that you'd like me to go into greater detail on. And I'm glad to take any questions. But also, this will be coming back to you with much greater detail. I think Tegan, Gina, Andrea Harris-Long, MAPC's deputy, who I think is also on today, and I have a conversation, and Margie have a conversation very soon to go through the details of this and make sure that the draft looks as close to a final draft before it comes back to all of you.
Yeah, and thanks, Lizzie. No, I think that's great. This is, like you said, a starting conversation, so people have some background, especially those who are new to this committee and the board. So I think it'd be great just to answer any questions. I know there's often a little bit of confusion and questioning around the roles of the agencies and how we work together. So maybe just kind of starting there as to whether there are any questions, and then we'll move on from there.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Tegan. I'd be happy to facilitate questions from committee members. I guess I'll start just to reiterate what was said and what I think we all agree on is the necessity to just have this on paper. Not because we don't all work very well together, but because just in case, God forbid, anything happens and none of us are here the next day, someone has to pick up, start over, they'll know kind of what we're doing. So I really appreciate not only the work that you all have been doing to get this there, and I appreciate that someone's 10-yard line or goal line it might be different from your own, Lizzie. So I really appreciate the amount of effort that's been put into this. I guess my question is just if you have a sense of the timeline, kind of when we reasonably might expect to see a document and kind of what you think the timeline should be for bringing it to the full MPO board.
I'll let Tegan kick that. Thanks.
I would like to reserve an estimate on the time frame for now, Brian, just because, as Lizzie mentioned, as she stepped into this role, MAPC's done a lot of work to really review, re-review, and clarify. And on our side, at the MPO, we haven't had a chance yet to go through that in detail. That's the meeting that Lizzie mentioned that will be coming up later in June. So we'll be spending the next month ourselves as well, kind of going through what's changed, what's the same. Once we know where we're at together, I think we can make a better estimate as to whether we are, in fact, just a few steps away from the finish line, or do we still have, a number of months to get it right. And part of that is also still, we haven't yet decided exactly how we want to sort of approach looking at the cost allocation plan. It can get incredibly complex, and we don't want that. We want to do something that is, kind of efficient, but we haven't quite figured out that plan yet either. So I'd like to reserve an estimate on the time for now, and come back to you maybe at the next meeting with a better estimate of that.
Okay, well, I'm going to push you a little bit on that, Tegan, just because
Fair.
I've worked in government a long time, as have all of us. And I think we all know that unless there's a deadline on things, things tend to take a little longer. So I would request, and let's just leave it as a request at this point, that, before the federal fiscal year starts October 1st, maybe we could agree to come back and talk about this in a little more detail.
I think that's a very good goal, Brian. And I think, it's not, Tegan and I certainly have our own internal deadlines on this. It's really just making sure that the details are in a strong enough place that it's in the right spot to give to you.
And I have full faith and confidence in you folks, and it's really just more of a guideline than anything else. But yeah, let's shoot for the end of September, October 1st. I'd appreciate it. Dennis
Perfect,
Giamatti,
Brian.
I see your hand up, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Liz, could you just give me from your perspective with fresh eyes on the relationship, what your thoughts are? How is the relationship working? And are there areas that you're looking to tighten up from an agreement standpoint?
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I really appreciate the question. I should also just say, like, I have really appreciated coming into this role and having the opportunity to work with Tegan. I consider her a close colleague. I have enormous respect for the work that she does with the team, with all of the many boards that she runs in her role. We talk frequently. We text pretty frequently too. So I feel that there's like a strong relationship between the organizations, and that's actually part of the reason why when I started like getting into the meat of the fiduciary agreement, I was like, this is actually not an accurate reflection of the roles and responsibilities across these two organizations and the role that MAPC is playing in this fiduciary space. And so it was actually very important to me, and sort of for better or for worse, I have a legal background. Sometimes that's deeply annoying to folks, including my own team. But it meant that I really felt like because it is a legal agreement, like we needed to make sure that all the details were correct. Honestly, the fiduciary agreement itself is the first, like, I think it's 5-ish pages of the document itself, 4 pages of the document are really just an update on the legal relationship between MAPC as the fiduciary and the Boston Region MPO. Some of that is also just updating old language that's in there that wasn't reflective of the way that relationship exists. The meat of those details in the appendix around the legal, HR, and finance responsibilities are the places where I think we both felt, like Tegan and I both felt like we needed to update those pieces so that they were really reflective. I will say, Tegan and I are also having ongoing conversations about because we have financial staff and we have some HR staff that actually are in both organizations, but MAPC still serves that fiduciary role. In HR and in finance, we are also kind of looking at those roles and responsibilities of staff across both organizations, which I think will be a longer conversation than finalizing this fiduciary agreement. But that's the place where I feel like we're going to want to look a little more closely. But having an agreement that outlines the roles and responsibilities is the thing that kicks off that conversation.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
I can build on that just slightly for Dennis, which is that when I took on this role, gosh, I think it's almost 7 years now. One of the things that became pretty clear pretty fast is that we want to and we do work together well as agencies, but where there were challenges were often where the roles were not super clearly defined between the organizations, just because it was just unclear, like who had responsibility for what. So I just want to echo what Lizzie's saying. Those details do really matter, and it helps us work together more smoothly, because at the end of the day, we want the fiduciary arrangement to go smoothly so that we can also coordinate together on regional work. Yeah. And so that's what I view this as enabling us to do even more smoothly.
Yeah, I think it is actually about eliminating some of those sticky places. Like ideally, the fiduciary is not something we're always thinking about.
Well, Lizzie, I for one, I'm glad you're an attorney by training. So. Thank you.
Sometimes my staff is too, sometimes not so much, but I appreciate that, Brian.
Well, from my perspective, I think it's great. So thank you. Mr. John Strauss, please.
Hey, John.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, Lizzie. I just had a question, being new here, just about the nature of the relationship that we're talking about. Is the MAPC a consultant type of relationship where you oversee the personnel and HR type stuff? Are we a subsidiary of the MAPC? Or is the relationship kind of like if you're in charge of a trust where you just basically oversee the spending and the beneficiary, which would be us, does, within the legal guidelines?
Yep.
So,
It's most like that latter, and I can also ask Margie to kind of weigh in on the more she's closer to legal practice than I am. But it's most like that latter one. Like if you think of a fiduciary, it's really in that support role. But again, the nature of the relationship between the organizations is that MAPC's legal is also the Boston Region MPO's legal. Our HR team is also the Boston Region MPO's HR team, and our finance team is also their finance team. But it's in that support space. But the piece that I think is actually important in the fiduciary role is that the fiduciary actually also has a responsibility to make sure that whoever is in that role, that in this case the Boston Region MPO, is making sound financial decisions that won't then put sort of the MAPC organization in financial harm. So that's kind of the lens through which we're looking. It's why it's a little bit more like that trust situation you're describing, but not exactly. Margie, do you want to give any additional details here on this?
Sure. Hi, I'm Margie Weinberger. John, I'm the general counsel for APC and the Boston Region MPO. So I have a lot of hats. And we're unique in our fiduciary role. We're not your typical financial fiduciary because we are the employer for the MPO. We are the employer of record and we are the legal representative. So all legal liability lie with MAPC because as the MPO established in their own agreement, neither the MPO nor the Boston Region MPO are legal organizations. So in order to advance themselves, to go after grants, to hire people, all of those responsibilities needed a legal representative to give them that cover, to give them their insurance, and make sure that all legal responsibilities were adhered to. And so MAPC has somewhat of an unusual fiduciary role in that we take on some responsibilities that you wouldn't see even in a trust organization, but we have assumed all legal responsibilities for the Boston Region MPO so that it can move forward and receive grants and hire staff and be responsive to all legal responsibilities.
Good, John?
So, sorry. Oh, if I could just ask one more question,
Please.
and Margie may know. So we have our own independent sources of funding, the grants that we get and so forth. And what is the do we have to then sort of clear that with the MAPC, or does that stay within certain legal boundaries that are set by the federal government, or are we free to go out and spend the money on hot dogs, or how does that work with
Not
you
hot
two?
dogs.
Hot dogs. Never food.
Hot dogs. We have some standards as a fiduciary. Seriously, you are very independent in your day-to-day work at the Boston Region MPO. You are responsible for overseeing the work. You use our legal status to be able to go after grants, sign contracts, enter into lease agreements, enter into procurements. All of the functionality has legal protection, but your day-to-day functions and how you function is overseen by Tegan and her staff.
And so, John, I end up signing those contracts, but they're based on grant applications that the BRMPO team has put, an enormous amount of time and effort into pursuing and being awarded. And then if there were any legal ramifications from those, they would escheat to MAPC, not to the Boston Region MPO.
And just in terms of how we spend that funding, that's dictated by the grant agreements, which are driven by federal. These are typically federal funds, John. So I don't know if that's helpful as well.
Yeah, so we don't.
Yeah,
I
wasn't trying to imply that we go around and just throw money around, throwing quarters around like manhole covers. But I just wanted to understand, where do we stand? It's just a little unclear because we are kind of independent, but now suddenly we're under this legal umbrella, so they're kind of like an insurance company, I guess. I don't know.
And to be clear, it's always been that way. It has been that way since the beginning of the Boston Region MPO. It's definitely not new to this moment. It's just that we are updating the agreement to memorialize the actual relationship between the organizations.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
More hot dogs for all of us, John. No, seriously, the two organizations work very well together, and I'm really grateful for that. And I don't think any of us are trying to throw a proverbial spanner in the works. It's really just memorializing it so that we have something on paper. Like I said, God forbid if all of us disappear tomorrow, someone else could do this. So, and agreements from the 70s need to be updated every so often. I think we all can agree that that's good practice.
Older than me.
Except for perhaps for Leonard Diggins, who likes to disagree with me. So, Leonard, the floor is yours, sir.
Disagree with you, Brian. Never, never. But since we're probably not going to get to Tegan's goals, I'm going to go ahead and ask a curiosity question because Lizzie, congratulations, on your new gig. I have not had a chance to tell you that personally, and forgive me for that. But I'm delighted that you are in your current role. It's great. So you mentioned it's been this way since the beginning. Is this like how all MPOs are set up?
No. This is actually an unusual relationship.
Right.
Most of the MPOs across the Commonwealth actually are nested within their regional planning agency. That's true actually of all of our major metro sister regional planning agencies across the country. So Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Chicago, they are actually all also the MPO. But I think there's a political history that predates, I think, everybody on this call actually, about how that initial decision was made to kind of separate out the MPO and the regional planning agency. And then because of that, when the MPO was created in 1974, MAPC actually had been created in statute in 1963, so predated the creation of the MPO by about 9 years. But from the moment that the MPO was created, there was this independence from the regional planning agency.
Just a little bit of clarity on that too. On the national scale, Len, what Lizzie said is absolutely true. I have a pretty deep exposure to the different MPO structures across the country because I'm on the AMPO board. Even though this is unique in Massachusetts and it's somewhat less usual in some of the major metro areas, there are many different examples of governance structures across the country. There are some MPOs that are housed within the major cities. There are some MPOs that are housed within the regional governments. There are some MPOs that are housed in entirely other entities, either temporarily or permanently. There are also quite a few independent MPOs that are standalone legal entities that have been created in their either major metro or otherwise areas. So it runs the gamut because of the political context varied all across the country at the time in the 70s. There are also changes that have happened in governance over the decades for certain MPOs. So it really is kind of all over the map in terms of across the country.
Yeah. And I see that too on my side because I sit with our National Organization of Regional Planning Agencies, which is also very closely related to some of the city and county organizations. And so Tegan's exactly right. There's like kind of as many different ways to have its governance, but traditionally in Massachusetts, this relationship is a bit unusual.
Yeah, I guess efficiencies are context dependent, be that you couldn't say that one general type is more efficient than another. Okay. I'm seeing
I think there's no rule.
Yeah, got you. Okay.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you. Appreciate it. No disagreement there, Brian. Just curiosity. Thank you.
Len, I appreciate everything you do and say. Thank you, sir. Any other questions for Lizzie or Tegan on this particular topic? I think we'll be coming back to this particular discussion at our next meeting, if not before. So seeing no more questions, Lizzie, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time.
And if any, you're all welcome to reach out. You know where to find me. You know where to find Tegan. If there are other questions, feel free to reach out. But definitely this is an opening conversation, and I really appreciate the time.
No, thank you. And Margie, thank you for all you do for us. We really appreciate you as well. Thank you. So folks, I'm going to make the call here. It's 9:57 and we're not going to get to item 7. Tegan gave us a pretty detailed memo. So everybody should take a look at that memo. And if there's any specific questions, we can ask Tegan that directly. We'll move to member items. Item number 8. Are there any member items to share? Seeing none, our next meeting will be announced probably September. August is tough to get people together, but we'll let you know very soon, and we'll be in discussion with that. With that, if there's no other additional business, is there a motion to adjourn? Leonard?
I'll take the opportunity and make the motion to adjourn and say that it is a great memo, Tegan. 8 pages of great reading. Thank you.
Here, here. Is there a second?
I'll
Well, you know
second.
what? David Moeller style, without objection, we're adjourned.